What is HelloFresh? With HelloFresh, you get farm fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip the trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Fall is right around the corner, and HelloFresh is there to help you plan for the busy season ahead with tasty dishes delivered right to your door. You just simply choose recipes and pick your delivery date, then lay back and enjoy the last days of summer, knowing that dinner is covered. Parents have enough back-to-school shopping and planning to do. Let HelloFresh get the groceries and save you some cash with pre-portioned meals, again, delivered right to your door. So when life gets busy, don't call for delivery, go with HelloFresh. I've been using HelloFresh for a while now, and I cannot tell you how much simpler making dinner has become. It really does give me one less thing to worry about. So go to HelloFresh.com/50whokilled and use code 50whokilled for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/50whokilled and use code 50whokilled for 50% off plus free shipping. Slow Burn Media, an evergreen podcast, presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
Julianne Williams loved the outdoors. She could have never known that a final outing before embarking on a new career would be the last trip she'd ever take. The 24-year-old Minnesota native was murdered in the Shenandoah National Park, down this trail just off the Skyline Drive. Park rangers are guarding the crime scene, not letting anyone down the narrow dirt trail.
No, you need to go back up beyond the tape now.
Okay. Williams and her friend Lollie Winans were found with their throats slashed on Saturday. They were finishing up a trip that started in New York and ended in the Shenandoah Valley. Williams, one of 4 children, was a geology major who graduated from college magna cum laude 2 years ago. Family and friends remember her and what she loved to do.
She always is hiking, always camping. She was extremely proficient at it. She had taken many people up into the Boundary Waters, had taken numerous classes, first aid classes. Was an expert at that. I would have gone with her at any time.
The Appalachian trails are still being hiked through here. Many park visitors, though, unaware of what happened to the 2 young women. Those that are enjoying the park's beauty while looking over their shoulders. In the Shenandoah National Park, I'm Michelle Mowry, News Channel 6.
Hello and welcome to episode 181 of Who Killed. I'm your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media and Evergreen podcast production. On this week's episode, I am super excited to have Kathryn Miles, author of Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. And welcome to the show, Kathryn.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I am very privileged to have you on the show. I had an opportunity to read the book. It is any true crime fan's cup of tea, I can tell you that. And it was really a fantastic read. And I have to start with, how did you get involved with this case? Because it is really tragic.
Yeah, this was a murder that took place in May of 1996, and I first learned about it very shortly afterwards. I was that's the same age, really, as Lollie and Julie when they were murdered. And, as a fellow backpacker and a fellow sexual assault survivor, their story really resonated with me. And, it was one of multiple murders that I had learned about that had occurred either on or just off the Appalachian Trail, which had really kind of been like a home for me and where I really felt, the safest and the strongest. And so when I had learned quite suddenly that these murders had taken place and that these, strong, experienced backcountry leaders had not only been murdered doing what they loved, but also what I really loved, it really sort of shattered my sense of security and changed my relationship with the wilderness.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book, and you do say that it sort of it took the innocence away of the outdoors and as you mentioned, it was sort of your happy place, your safe place. And yeah, when tragedy strikes in an environment like that where you don't expect it, it's definitely an eye opener, and it does change the way that you kind of go about your life. You know, what was your connection to the women that were involved with this case?
Yeah, you know, and I think, when you kind of think back to the 1990s, if you're old enough to think back to the 90s, there was like such a sort of like, culture of the time. And when you look at pictures of Lollie and Julie and you see them with like their bandanas tied around their heads and things like that, they really were, I think, in a lot of ways, the kind of people that a lot of us really wanted to emulate. They were social justice leaders, they were volunteers, they were really interested in humanitarian projects, and they were also just a ton of fun. Lollie loved the Grateful Dead and jam bands, and Julie had this awesome sense of humor and was always making people laugh. And so I think that they were just really, especially for women my age, people who were in their early 20s when this happened, it was hard to look at them and not kind of, idolize or idealize them a little bit, I think. But it wasn't until a few years later in 2001 when I, by total coincidence, took a college teaching job at the college where Lollie had been a student, Unity College, that I really got a larger sense of kind of who she was as a person. And, her legacy and her spirit just pervaded that entire campus. And, seeing that and getting to know the people who were really close with her really kind of brought her to life for me in a way that hadn't happened yet.
Yeah. And so when you were there, you basically realized there was a story there and something that you could relate to. And was it something that you instantly started thinking about writing about, or did you decide that, was it just something that like evolved naturally, organically, I should say, through just being at the university or at the college?
Yeah, it was definitely more of an evolution. My very first day of teaching, I was 27, just out of grad school, had no idea what I was doing. And, my first day of teaching was September 9th, 2000, or no, sorry, September 9th, 2001. And then, so the second day was September 11th, right? Like I brand new at all of this, had no idea what I was doing, and definitely did not know how to be, sort of a leader and a facilitator at a community that had been, rocked by September 11th, I think, like everybody else had. And, our campus was still really feeling the effects of that terrorist attack in the spring of 2002, when John Ashcroft, who was the Attorney General at the time, made this very public, nationally televised press conference where he announced that an indictment had been made in the murder of Lollie and Julie, and that this individual, Daryl David Rice, was known to hate gays and lesbians. And so John Ashcroft would be using brand new hate crime legislation to seek the death penalty in the case. And in that moment, this became the first federal hate crime in our nation's history. And what really struck me at the moment was not just all of the attention that it brought back to campus and brought back to this particular crime, but there was this moment in the press conference where John Ashcroft was trying to draw these comparisons between the terror that had happened with September 11th, and that by prosecuting Daryl Rice and putting him to death, that we would somehow as a nation heal from the terrorist attacks. And even at the time, I thought, how do these two things connect? And that's still not really clear to me. But that announcement and that connection that he tried to make made this such a political and such a sort of hot button media topic that all of a sudden I found myself sort of at the absolute epicenter of all of these discussions again about the crime and who had committed it and why. And so having that firsthand experience was a really powerful one for me, especially somebody who was so young and such a new teacher too.
Yeah, it's got to be being in a small college like Unity. I'm assuming that the story was still pretty prevalent being only 5 years out, basically. Was it still something that students talked about?
All of the time. It's such a small campus. When I was there, it was about 500 undergraduates, 30 faculty members. And it was this super hippie, crunchy kind of, 1960s counterculture kind of campus. And we used to joke that it was like the Hotel California, right? You could check out, but nobody ever left. So the alumni stuck around. They started their own like back to the land farms and orchards, and they were raising goats and things. And so a lot of Lollie's friends became my friends, and so knowing her through them and then watching how much this announcement and this indictment and the eventual sort of court proceedings really influenced them really brought home for me just how fresh and continuous the grief and the heartbreak and the fear was from this 1996 murder. And, I think especially as true crime fans, that's something that we forget is that, for the loved ones that victims leave behind, it doesn't get easier. The grief doesn't go away. The sense of like haunting questions and lack of closure, like time doesn't heal that, And I think that was my first real exposure to that and my first real understanding of just how pervasive, those feelings are for people who have lost loved ones in violent crimes.
Yeah, that's definitely an eye opener for you, I'm sure. And I mean, just losing students on a campus where 500 people, that's less than the amount of people. I mean, I had 550 people in my high school. And, it's just like, if we had 2 people killed, that would be the talk for the rest of eternity. So I can imagine that it was still very, very much a topic of conversation. And you said it was very hippie-ish. So assuming that, Lollie and Julie, they basically were very outdoorsy. And I'm assuming that is something that the campus obviously embraces. And, that would probably have been completely impacted by this crime. Is that something that you noticed through your interactions with the students?
100%. I mean, this is a college that has an environmental studies mission. And, one of the things that was so great about this school was that we were so outdoor focused. And so, all of the students coming in did a 10-day wilderness trip as part of their orientation. And, we as faculty and staff would go out on those trips with them. We were always really encouraged to take students backpacking, so I would always incorporate that into my courses, whether it was taking students to the desert Southwest for 2 weeks, or we'd go down to the island of Dominica and do like snorkeling and scuba diving, or even just, backpacking and camping here in Maine. So, the wilderness was really our classroom in a lot of ways. And so to have that violence then associated with the classroom, and to know that this leader of, who was finishing up her degree to become a leader in, wilderness therapy, that she had been murdered doing this really, really changed the tenor of that campus in ways that I don't think we even really understood at the time.
Is this kind of what drove you to write for Outdoors, or do the article?
Yeah. I was always really, when I was a full-time professor there, I was always really encouraged to kind of do that kind of outreach writing. I think a lot of professors, all of their writing lives is dedicated to like really esoteric scholarship and research papers. But I was lucky enough that I could do more sort of like popular press, glossy magazine writing. And, after I left teaching there full-time, I did start working as a trail correspondent for Outside Magazine, which was just, such a thrill, right? I was literally spending a season either on the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail or the Continental Divide Trail, and hanging out with hikers and backpackers. And for me, that was a dream come true of a job.
It would
And
be
that's
like
what I was
somebody
doing.
saying, it'd be like somebody saying, go spend the year skiing and just write about it and be like, oh, right.
And we'll send you some really cool new gear, right? Do you want some telly skis? Here's some
Yeah.
telly skis.
And we get you in the back door, like you sort of get that extra privilege of yeah, oh gosh, that's awesome. That is so awesome. A dream
Yeah,
come
I
true
am
right there.
very aware that I have a very lucky job. I'm very aware of how fortunate I am to get to kind of do the work that I get to do 100%.
That's again, being passionate about what you do is really, that's what's the point of living if you're not passionate about your job, because you only live once. And that's another reason why this case is so tragic, is these girls were just so young. They were just beginning their lives and never really got to start it.
Yeah, and they were already poised to do so much great work. Julie had trained as a geologist, but she was also fluent in Spanish, and she had been doing a lot of work translating for domestic abuse survivors. She'd done missionary work in Central and South America. She'd done a bunch of work on Native American land in like really remote places in Minnesota. And Lollie had this very articulated goal of creating an outward bound kind of experience for sexual assault survivors, where they could find that same kind of sort of strength in the wilderness that I think she and I had. And so knowing that, and knowing that they had all of this expertise, and that they had this incredible love story. They had met and fallen in love in the wilderness, and by all accounts of their friends and the people close to them, it was just this sort of like once in a lifetime love at first sight kind of romance. And it was really important to me to tell that part of the story too, because this is in a lot of ways a love story, which I think makes the end all the more tragic.
Yeah, 100%. I think when you involve emotions that are just, if they're just a couple friends out camping, tragic, absolutely tragic. But then you throw in the fact that they were in love and they were going down this, path that they hadn't been down before, and the opportunities and all of the things that they could have experienced were just taken away from them. And it's so unfair in this world that can happen. And like, here's another thing. Like, I was just wondering, like, when you started researching this, had you done any true crime reporting before you did an article on these two women?
Kind of. I think of myself primarily as a science writer and a science reporter. So the true crime type work I had done was either related to forensic testing, things like genealogical DNA, and it was also then the environmental component. So I had written about crimes and missing persons in the wilderness. So that was my entree into this a lot more than people who have like a crime beat and are covering courts and things like that. And so for me, one of the biggest learning curves when I got started on this project, because this case had been a federal capital crime, and because it had gone all the way to jury selection before prosecutors suspended the case, there were, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of publicly accessible court documents, which made it a little unusual and made it different than some of the cases that have happened around it or that are ultimately kind of compared to it. And so figuring out how to navigate all of those court documents and what they meant was definitely a challenge. I had a research assistant who was a law student here at the UMaine Law School, and she was so patient and wonderful about helping me sort through all these boxes of documents, figuring out which ones really were worth our time and what to look for and what to ask for. And so that was like a crash course in like criminal law 101 that I hadn't really had in terms of my background.
Yeah, talk about jumping in feet first. I mean, just right into the deep end in this particular case, because sometimes you have to work your way up to this type of tragedy, and you're literally reporting on one of the saddest and most horrific crime scenes. I mean, this wasn't this wasn't just some strangulation or something like that. This was a real scary place to be. If, when, I mean, I feel terrible for the people that found the bodies and found the crime scene.
Yeah, and I had to really have some long conversations with myself before I took this on as a book project. When it was a feature story for a magazine, I was like, I'm not going to have to go too deep into the really scary stuff, right? I can avoid the really scary stuff. But as soon as my agent and my editor and I started talking about the prospect of a book, I knew that like all of those sort of filters were going to immediately come off. And I had just come off of writing a series of stories about a hiker named Jerry Largay, who was this amazing 64-year-old grandmother who was hiking the Appalachian Trail and had gone missing here in Maine. And it became one of the biggest manhunts in the state's history. It went on for years. Initially, the authorities, the Maine game wardens and people like that, had really suspected foul play. And I had become so enmeshed in that story, had really reported on it pretty full time for the Boston Globe and had gotten to know her family. And her body had finally been found, and authorities figured out that she hadn't been murdered, but she had just gotten tragically lost, and somehow managed to keep herself alive for 21 days, even though she just had 3 days of food. And so it was this survival story. And it was also this like heartbreaking story of this woman starving to death and writing these letters goodbye to her family members. And then the state police accidentally sent all of the crime scene photos to me, which I was not expecting to see. And that took a huge toll on me emotionally. It really knocked me flat out. And so when the prospect of doing this book about Lollie and Julie came up, I was really aware of the emotional toll that this had already taken on me. And, what's happened to people like Michelle McNamara, who wrote I'll Be Gone in the Dark, or David Carr, who, committed suicide after reporting on crimes. And so I knew that there was a legacy of writers who had gotten so invested in stories that it had ultimately like taken their lives. And I knew that I was the kind of person who's really emotionally susceptible to that. So I was not super enthusiastic going into this idea of a book because I was really worried that it might destroy me along the way.
It's a concern. I'm impressed that you took it on, but you definitely have to take some serious soul searching before you go into a project. I know that when I first started into the first case that I worked on, and that was the Amy Mahalovic case, I spoke with one of the guys that had been involved with writing about it, and he warned me. He said, once you get your name attached to it, it's going to forever be attached to it, and just remember that. And for a minute it kind of pushed me back because I was like, oh, okay. So like, you have to be, one, respectful obviously of the situation, and two, you kind of have to be an authority on the subject matter and then be responsible with it. It's there's a lot that goes with it. Can I ask though, how did you get involved with writing with the Globe?
I don't know, proximity maybe. It helps to live in Maine and kind of be their correspondent. I started studying and participating in journalism when I was a high school student. And so I just slowly kind of built up a little bit of a resume. And for me, the thing I love the most about journalism is having the chance to really tell people's stories in depth and really have that big narrative, kind of like the classic old journalism. And there aren't a lot of places left where you can still tell those long stories, and the Globe is one of them. Outside Magazine is another one. So I'm always looking for places that, instead of saying we have 500 words we can give you for this story, I always want 5,000 words to really tell the story. And so I'm always kind of seeking out those kinds of places.
Yeah, I'm actually an old school trained newspaper guy. I was a school editor for the school paper, and so I love, I probably watch all the President's Men 4 times a year. No, I love the old school journalism. Spotlight, fabulous movie.
So
and,
good.
It's so good. So good. And no, I do love journalism, and I just the Globe. That is great that they still have that ability to write longer stories. I mean, that's actually one of the reasons why I started podcasting, was because I used to work in the news, and you can only tell a story in in television news in 2 minutes. Really, are you going to get a story across? Not really. So podcasting became a great medium, and that's why we can sit here and have this very deep conversation about Julie and Lollie's case, because there is no set time frame. We don't have to worry about somebody saying cut or we got to be
Well, I
within
really
this many
appreciate that you
inches.
say, I really love that you say conversation too, because I feel like that's so important, right? And that's what's so great about podcasts like yours, is that, so often, like when we're just writing or researching, it feels like we're doing it in solitude. And so the idea of having a conversation, not just among, for instance, the two of us, but among listeners too, that they get to be a part of the conversation too. I feel like that's really important, especially for these unsolved crimes. I've been really excited by like the kind of crowdsourcing that happens with podcasts or with discussion boards, in terms of people really working together to move cases forward. And I wholeheartedly believe in the power of that.
Oh yeah, 100%. And it's a community. It's interesting. The whole true crime community very much wants everybody to do well, because everybody is, when you do well, you're doing some service for somebody's family. I try to focus on unsolved cases mostly because of the fact that there are just way too many of them, and there are a lot of people out there that aren't blonde hair and blue eyes, and I use that line here and there when I meet people, because it's like, for every Elizabeth Smart, there's 40 other girls that have gone missing and aren't reported on, or maybe get a story or a blurb in the newspaper, but that's it. And when you go back and you try to research on these cases, you really realize, wow, this has been a long time bias. And it's kind of tragic. And the whole newspaper industry, that's another tragedy, but that's a topic for another day, let's say. But
I'm really glad to
the
hear
Globe
you
seems
call
to be doing
attention.
well.
Yeah, and I'm really glad to hear you call attention to the need for more coverage of crimes involving, people who are ethnic minorities or racial minorities, or, different sexual gender orientations. I've been doing a little bit of work on, Native crimes against Native American and First Nation women too, and especially like in Western Canada and the Western US. And holy cow, if any of those women got even a fraction of the attention that, as you said, like, attractive white women get, talk about a sobering set of statistics that we haven't begun to unpack as a country yet.
The Canadian Indigenous issue is absolutely disgusting and a crime against humanity. And for the people that don't know what we're talking about, there are a few podcasts that the CBC has done on missing and endangered, and I think Missing Cleo or Finding Cleo. There's just a bunch of them, but it's basically like the horrors that these people have gone through, and then they continue to go through, especially here in America where we have reservations, and I think it's 1 out of every 3 women are sexually assaulted or something along. It's a really high number, and it might even be higher than that, because I don't know if it's just part of the culture or what, but it's very sad. It's very sad. And again, like you mentioned, these cases do need coverage, and that's why I feel like it's good to have a long form conversation about that, because how the hell are you going to tell that story on the news?
Yeah. And it's a social, it's a
I mean,
social justice issue. And I think sometimes we forget, we look at a crime in isolation and we forget to look at all of the social issues that are underlying it. One of the things that was really interesting to me as I started doing this deep dive into crimes that occur in our national parks is just the really long and sad, tragic, unjust story of the formation of so many of our national parks. Shenandoah, where this murder of Lollie and Julie took place, there were thousands of Appalachian homesteaders who were forcefully evicted from their homes to build Shenandoah. You look at parks like Glacier National Park, again, untold Native American people evicted, or places like Lake Powell, which I love. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I grew up there, but it was flooding these sacred Native American spaces too. And so I think that we can't talk about violence in the wilderness without understanding, some of these larger social and environmental issues, and in some cases may even be contributing to the violence.
yes, yes, I would agree. I mean, we cannot put a bunch of people. One, everything we did was wrong. Like you just can't do that. Like we stole so much land and for so many different purposes and right, wrong, mostly wrong. What we ended up doing as far as like where are we going to put these people as we displace them, we didn't do them any service. We did them a disservice. And if you go to any reservation in this country, it's like going to another country and not a nice country. It's really sad.
Yeah, and for me, I go back all the time just because of my, training. Academic work is this idea of wilderness access too, and you look at a place like Shenandoah National Park, which was segregated well into like the 60s and 70s, where there was one place where Black people could go in the park, and, when you think about who feels like they have access to our wild places, there are untold numbers of people who, because of the color of their skin or their sexual orientation or their religion or their body types, feel like they're not safe in the wilderness. And these crimes against people like Lollie and Julie have only made that worse, to the point that there's like an entire generation of people who identify as either female or non-binary or LGBTQ who think that, because of this violence that's been perpetrated against queer and, female individuals, that they're just literally not safe in the wilderness anymore. And I really wanted to call attention to that phenomenon in this country, and really hopefully kind of spark a conversation about who gets to be in the woods and who gets to feel safe in the woods and why is it only some people.
It's a fabulous point because I grew up boating and sailing, and you just think about the water and how many people utilize the lake and this, that, and the other, and it's like we just don't give access to certain people. It's so unfair. It's just unfair. I'm just going to call it what it is. It's unfair. And we've lived in an unfair society for so long that it's become the norm almost. I mean, yeah, like you talk about the segregation in Shenandoah up until the 60s and 70s. I mean, that's insane. But there are also freaking states in this country that haven't passed anti-lynching laws yet. So, where are we? We're still where we were. It's just like been glossed over a little bit with some nicer stuff. And yeah, the problems still exist. And you talk about the other issues of national parks. What other murders did you uncover? Did you uncover anything else that was like that stood out to you as something like, whoa, I can't believe that happened?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that really stood out to me. The first was coming to understand that as a nation, we don't have a set of rules and regulations about how violent crimes are reported on our federal lands. So our national parks, our national forests, even like the Bureau of Land Management lands out west. There are no rules about which crimes get reported and which ones don't, and which ones get investigated and which ones don't. Outside Magazine did a piece a couple years ago, trying to unpack and kind of codify just how many people have gone missing without a trace on these lands, and it's thousands. And those are people who we don't know, like, did they fall to their deaths? Were they kidnapped? Were they murdered? Alien abduction? We have no idea. So that was part of it. And then the other thing that I think was really sobering for me was just trying to understand how hard it is to solve these crimes. The clearance rate for these wilderness crimes is the lowest in the nation compared to all other crimes. Crimes against law enforcement rangers and law enforcement rangers who are killed in the line of duty is exponentially higher than, for instance, FBI agents killed in the line of duty. And then, just trying to figure out, like, what is a backcountry crime scene? What is the motivation there? That kind of stuff. Like, the FBI is at least the retired FBI agents that I talk to are very frank about talking about how they're just way over their heads in those sorts of crimes. I talked to some of the folks who investigated the Yosemite murders, that Carrie Stainer was responsible for, and the agents were really, really honest and candid with me. They were like, "We had no idea what we were doing. We were not trained in backcountry homicide forensic investigation." Two of the agents were telling me that they had even interviewed Carrie Stainer fairly early on in the process, but they were so sure that this had to have been a crime committed by people who knew each other, that they basically just had this creepy conversation with Carrie Stainer and then never thought about him again. And then he went on to murder another woman, in or right near the park. And so, I think as a country still, like, when we think homicide, we think Law and Order, right? The TV show, or CSI. We think about, an apartment or an alley or something like that. We do not think about a backcountry campsite or a place that doesn't really have an obvious beginning and end. And our justice system doesn't really know what to do with those places.
Yeah, let's expand on that a little bit, because the crime scene in this case, I mean, again, we're talking, like you said, backcountry murder with, there's obviously animals, there's obviously rain, there's weather, all sorts of different things that can impact a crime scene. And in this particular case, I mean, explaining the crime scene a little bit. Because it was pretty. Yeah. I don't know what the right word. I don't know what the right word is to say, other than like. Yeah, I mean, it's just like you just came across something that's just like, okay, yeah.
And that is exactly what I think the FBI agents who worked the case. I think that would be the technical term that they would use to describe the crime scene too. So what
very
we
professional
know is that. Yeah. Lollie and Julie arrived at Shenandoah either on May 18th or May 19th, 1996. And they both were really avid journal keepers, and they were doing a lot of journal writing while they were there. So we're able to recreate their itinerary pretty exactly in some ways for their time in the park. And for reasons that have never been clear to either the rangers, the FBI agents, forensic experts, and now me, is they somehow found their way onto this little known trail that used to be a horse trail decades earlier and had just grown completely unused. And being really good backcountry campers, they knew that that the best way to set up a campsite and be safe is to what backpackers call stealth camping, right? Which is, you don't go to a campground. You find a secret spot off the trail that you've bushwhacked to where you're totally hidden. And that's basically the best way to build security for yourself. So that's what they did. And they had set up their camp along a stream. This was off of this trail that nobody ever used. So the first question that I think everyone had at the time and still has is, how did this murderer ever even find them? And I speculate a little bit about that in the book. But this individual was so skilled and like hauntingly sophisticated as a murderer, had a murder kit that had a knife and duct tape and gloves and, possibly a gun, um, you know, subdued these two really strong athletic women and their dog, managed to bind and gag them, um, sexually assaulted Julie, we think, and then, murdered them with just this very brutal, slice to the neck, and then managed to leave without a trace, so that's what the authorities were up against, plus the fact that it took days before anyone knew the women were even missing. And then it took longer even for the authorities to even figure out where they were because their campsite was so hidden. So by the time they were found, some days had gone by. The medical examiner of Virginia made the conclusion that the women had been murdered on May 28th. Their bodies were found on the night of June 1st, and the investigation didn't really start until June 2nd. So, some time had passed. And as you say, there's weather, there's animals, and I had gone through the murder scene with some of the FBI investigators and their evidence response team. And as one of the guys says to me at the crime scene, he's like, look around, like, how many rocks do you see? And there's obviously hundreds, if not thousands of rocks. And he's like, one of these could be a murder weapon, and 999 of them could just be rocks. And as an investigator, how do you figure out the difference? And the FBI is trained to investigate urban crimes. They're not trained to really investigate backcountry crimes. So there was this huge culture clash between the law enforcement rangers and the FBI that ultimately, I think, resulted in some mishandling of evidence and some missteps that made it that much harder to solve this crime.
Yeah, securing that crime scene and then figuring out when the bodies, when they were murdered is super important when it comes to, determining who could be responsible because, again, you talk about in the book, like how they, the investigation begins and they're kind of like dilly-dallying around about it. They're like, yeah, they'll come back or, whatever, when they were reported missing. And then they find the bodies. Obviously, we've got a problem. And so it's like when I read the book, I just thought to myself how scary those last few minutes must have been for those two women, and thinking that they're safe by doing what you just said, doing what they were supposed to do, following the things that they were trained to do. These aren't inexperienced backpackers. And then to have what happened had to have just been the absolute worst. And then to seriously investigate this case, you have to go backtracking. You have to start looking at all these old videos, seeing what you can find. I mean, this is 96, so we're not talking about lots of CCTV or anything like that. And, it was a brutal, brutal murder scene. And both women, now don't get me wrong, or correct me if I'm wrong, were they both in their sleeping bags still?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Lollie was in the tent, and she was gagged with her long underwear, and her arms were duct taped behind her back, and her legs were bound with another piece of long underwear. And she was found lying face down in her sleeping bag in the tent. Authorities speculate that the perpetrator murdered her first and that he really had Julie in his sights as a target. He separated them and took Julie along with her sleeping bag and her sleeping pad over to near the stream. And there's some good evidence that he had sexually assaulted her with a vibrator that was found at the scene, and that he had also brought some like really creepy, like BDSM type sex toys and things that he had used. And so we think he probably had kept her alive for a while and had brutalized her before he then murdered her. And, you know, obviously I think a lot about the last moments of both of these women. And as you said, must have been like terror beyond anything we can imagine. And, as bad as it was for Lollie, I always go back also to Julie, who probably knew that Lollie had been murdered at that point. And what that must have been like, not only to know what's happening to you, but also to realize that the love of your life has been murdered in front of you. And I cannot imagine like the anguish that must have been like for her.
It's incomprehensible. I mean, it's a question that it's rhetorical. I mean, you really don't expect an answer because you really just don't know. It's just something everybody's left to ponder because, fortunately, we don't know exactly what it was like for them. And you can't put yourself in their position, but what you can do is you can figure out what got them there. And you said you had a couple theories on. I'm not gonna ask you to explain your theories because it's in the book, but there is definitely do you feel like once John Ashcroft came out with the indictment and stuff, we're gonna fast forward real quick. What do you think his end game was of that? Did you really think he believed it, or was it just sort of placate people? I'm trying to figure out exactly what his goal was there.
Well, and I asked him multiple times as I was researching the book. And
I'm sure he gave you a straight answer every time.
The ultimate answer he gave is that he doesn't have enough of a recollection of it to really say for sure, which is remarkable to me, given that this was the first federal hate crime. But I really, the investigators who were most intimately involved in this, the way they describe it is, the investigators really narrowed in on Darrell Rice for a variety of reasons that we can go into if you want. And they were working at the sort of regional level, right? The sort of Virginia regional level with this. And they were getting ready to go forward with an indictment on their own. And what they tell me was that basically, Ashcroft and the Justice Department basically just grabbed the case right out from under them with no explanation. And, literally, Julie's parents were in Virginia to make this announcement that it was going to go to this regional federal circuit court. And it was the day before the indictment. The prosecutor, in this, Western, I think it's like the Western division of the Virginia Circuit Court, was ready to make this announcement. And all of a sudden got a call from Ashcroft's assistant who said, no, this is our case now. And you all need to come to Washington, D.C. So you've got Julie's parents who are already feeling really fragile. Now they're being told that they need to come to Washington. And, what the individuals involved told me was they really felt like it was political theater. Lollie and Julie's sexuality, their relationship had been so politicized. We have no reason to believe that the person targeted them because of their sexuality. We have no reason to believe he didn't, let's be clear. But there's no evidence yet that this was actually an intentional hate crime. And yet, the Justice Department decided to make it one. And I think part of why it's been so difficult now to get this case closed, despite evidence that points to, I think, a pretty viable suspect who is not Darrell Rice. I think part of why it's so hard to get any closure is because the Justice Department had made this such a political issue and had made this such a high profile case with this indictment and this hate crime stuff, that now maybe there's some embarrassment and egg on the face of them. And so they're like, well, we'll just kind of let this quietly slip away, and maybe people won't remember that we were really sure that Darrell Rice had targeted them because they were lesbians. I don't know, but that's my speculation.
Yeah, and we're gonna get back to that in just a second, but yeah, definitely the egg on the face thing is true. I mean, you see it with DAs, people who don't want to, prosecutors who do not want to say they were wrong. They don't want to admit that they brought the wrong person to trial, And it's like they'll force a square peg into a round hole. And I don't even know if that's the right reference, but you know what I mean? It's just they'll force whatever story that they can. And with that being said, what were some of the things about Daryl Rice that they were focused in on and made them focus in on him?
Yeah, and so in July of 1997, Daryl Rice was sort of having the worst moment of his life. He's somebody who's been very candid about the fact that he's battled mental illness all of his life, a combination of bipolar and schizophrenia. And he, sometimes takes medication for it and sometimes doesn't. And the spring of 1997, he was off his meds. His whole life was unraveling. He'd been fired from his job as a computer programmer in Eastern Maryland near Baltimore. And he was in the park. His father lived right outside of the park, and he would spend a lot of time cycling in the park. He was in the park in July of 97. He'd been up for days. He was having a really bad bout of mental illness. He wasn't taking his medication. He was smoking a ton of weed. And while he was driving through the park kind of aimlessly, he had seen this female cyclist, a Canadian woman named Yvonne Malbasha. She was out cycling. And for whatever reason, he kind of got his sights on her. And he kind of drove back and forth and shouted some, harassing and menacing and frankly offensive things at her. And he threw a soda bottle at her. He ran her off the road. And he had said, I'm going to get you, right? Which was no doubt terrorizing for her, right? Was no doubt absolutely awful for her. And I'm not excusing his behavior. As soon as she was able to kind of get to a nearby store and report that this had happened, the Rangers tracked him down. And, they were like, Daryl, did you just like harass and threaten that woman back there? And he was like, no. And they were like, Daryl, did you just harass and threaten that cyclist back there? And he was like, okay, yeah, I wanted to ruin her day, and then he while he was chatting with them, because they were driving him back so that she could identify him in person, which I think must have been awful for her, right? We're going to bring your perpetrator back so you can look him in the eye and say, yeah, that's the guy. So I don't know why the Rangers thought that was a good idea. But as
I've
they were
read that
driving
before,
him
and I'm
back,
like, why are you doing that?
right. And so they're like chatting with him as they're driving him back to where this happened. And he says to them, did you ever catch the guy who killed those two women last summer? And between the combination of the fact that he had just assaulted a woman in the park and that he had just asked about the murder of Lollie and Julie, at that point, the law enforcement rangers in the park were so convinced that Daryl Rice had killed Lollie and Julie that they never really considered another suspect. And they still don't. Like, if you talk to them today, they'll tell you that they are completely convinced that Daryl Rice murdered Lollie and Julie, and there's nothing that's going to change their mind at this point.
I hate that. I mean, I'm just to be honest with you, tunnel vision is just such crap. I mean, it's ruined so many cases, and kept so many cases unsolved for that exact reason. When investigators, and everybody's human, this is absolutely not an insult to these investigators whatsoever. It's what they believe, and I can't put myself in their shoes. But what you brought up in your book, which definitely is very interesting and very controversial, not controversial, but I could see where they would have issues with, being potentially wrong. And that's why people need to read the book. But I think it is, with Daryl's case, you think about John Bonet, you think about like all these unsolved cases, and I know I just brought up a really famous one, but like it's that tunnel vision of just when you go on the path of it's got to be this person, or you brought up Cary Stayner, perfect example. He goes on to murder somebody else. Well, guess who's got blood on their hands? As much as it doesn't sound like, it's not. They were looking at something completely different. They're not trained to do what homicide detectives are just trained to do. And I think that's something you bring up in your book as well. And that is that there was one isn't there one person, one sheriff in charge of the whole trail?
The Appalachian Trail has one law enforcement ranger dedicated to it. Shenandoah
Yeah.
National Park had, I think, four law enforcement, maybe five law enforcement rangers at the time, short staffed, and again, they were,
Yeah.
the funding of the national parks has been a travesty since they've existed, and so, even I think a well-meaning law enforcement ranger is going to find some significant challenges in terms of being able to do their job. But, what I come back to again and again and again is some of the real like provincialism that started to happen with this case. So when this other suspect emerges, this known serial killer, whose DNA they cannot exclude from DNA found at the crime scene. They refuse to investigate this individual. And this is where this parochialism really starts to take off. Like, because this known serial killer had murdered young teenage women, they're completely convinced that he's a pedophile, despite the fact that these are teenagers who were sexually mature, right? So that's not pedophilia. And that there are many, many, many 15-year-old teenagers who look like 20-year-olds, but they would say things to me like, I would say like, well, why can't it be this guy? Why can't it be him? And they're like, well, he's a pedophile. And I'd say, well, how do you know? And they were like, well, we looked at his porn, and like the women had shaved genitalia. And in my head, I'm like, have you guys ever seen porn? Because like that's like the costume requirement for people, like men and women in most porn, but I think that that's just like, that's not their world. And so they just make these assumptions that have ultimately led this case to not be solved.
Yeah, that whole pedophile thing. I've run into that a few times in investigating cases, and it is amazing how many times you hear that. Well, they're a pedophile. They're into boys. They're into girls. And it's like, okay, well, did you look any further than that? Because, there's been, not every pedophile is the same, guys. Just like not every serial killer is the same. Yeah, are there similarities? Sure. Is there a commonality across the board? Absolutely. But does that mean that every single case is going to be the same? Hell no. And you can see how that would affect all these different cases. If an officer goes, well, he's into little boys, well, then they're not going to investigate him for the death of a girl. Or, this particular individual that seems very likely to be the suspect or the killer, like, yeah, these women were not, these were women. These weren't little girls. This wasn't even close to like, they were women. This isn't like, tunnel vision is just such a terrible thing. And it's human nature. I know. And it's terrible to blame or put blame on these individuals, but I'm not, cause I'm really not. I'm just more just frustrated with the fact that it impacts a lot of these different cases. You look at the Long Island serial killer case. They still don't know what's going on there. And it's just, they throw out all these different things. They malign all these different people. Like Julie and Lollie's sexuality being part of the reason they were killed. Like, come on. Like, where's the evidence? Like, you had mentioned that before. Like, where the hell's the evidence? And don't tell me you don't remember. Like, Mr. Ashcroft, just like, be honest and just say, yeah, well, we were trying to deflect against everything else that was going on in the country and whatever. It's just own it, because a lot of cases would be better off if they did.
And for me, there was a point in my research where, I realized that this case really crossed from just tunnel vision into something more like insidious. And, I mentioned earlier that when Ashcroft announced the indictment against Darrell Rice, he had said, well, we know that Daryl Rice said that he hates gay people. You know, we have a microphoned informant who recorded Daryl Rice saying he hates gay people. And it wasn't until the Innocence Project got involved with this case, and his defense team, you know, really great exoneration attorneys, said, well, can we hear that informant conversation that you recorded where he says he hates gay people? And they said, yeah, sure, here it is. And so they play it, and it goes something like this. Daryl Rice says, man, I'm so mad right now. And the informant says, well, why are you mad? And Daryl Rice says, they keep trying to get me to say that I hate gay people. And the guy's like, dude, that sucks. And Daryl Rice is like, yeah, right. You know, and so what they did was they took this tiny little snippet completely out of context, where if you hear the whole conversation, what Daryl Rice is saying is like, WTF, I clearly don't hate gay people, which if you look in his background is completely true. His roommate was gay. Like, he had really good friends who were gay. Like, you know, Daryl Rice is like the most accepting human on the planet, you know. But again, like, the Justice Department, in my opinion, you know, behaved unethically, immorally, potentially criminally in doing things like that. You know, like, they knew the conversation. They knew Daryl Rice was saying this is preposterous, and yet they used it in order to seek the death penalty against him. And I have some really big problems with that.
I do too. I think that's totally, you know, talk about taking things out of context, literally. And that is not how our justice system is supposed to work. If you didn't commit the crime, that means somebody else did. And just like in the Stainer case, well, there's a possibility that they're going to go out and kill again. Because if they're willing to kill 3, you know, or 2 people, and then in Stainer's case it was 3, and then the 4th, they're probably going to do it again. I mean, it's just, I have a feeling that what you found in your investigation is you're barking up the right tree. Like, that's the way I feel. Because, I mean, there are so many things about this case that just they don't want to recognize as screw-ups, or, oh, hey, we may have dropped the ball here. Well, okay, well, admit it. Like, then let's move on, and, like, it's okay. Just let's move on and stop talking about Daryl Rice and maybe look into this other individual, because, again, who cares? It's not about your ego. It's about bringing justice to these families, which, unfortunately, is it Lollie's family that's her parents aren't alive anymore, or Julie's family?
Her mom died. Lollie's mom died very shortly after. She was just completely destroyed by this. Her dad, by the time I started working on the book, her dad had been diagnosed with late stage Alzheimer's. And so while, you know, he was alive for a good part of the book, he obviously, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't ethical for me journalistically, you know, to be in touch with him. Julie's parents are alive, you know, they're well aware that they're aging, you know, and, you know, spoke with me really candidly about how important it is for them to have some kind of closure, you know, and to know that they obviously can't ever bring their daughter back, but if they could at least know that the person who did this had been brought to justice, or, you know, was no longer alive and couldn't do this to anyone else, that they would at least have that little bit of solace. And that, I think that's so important for these survivors, you know, is just, it's never going to bring the loved one back, but it's going to make the worst moment of their lives a little less terrible, you know, and that's important.
It's very important. And we'll wrap it up here in just a second. I just was wondering, don't you feel, you know, after you meet the parents, you're like you're like, I'm here until we get this thing solved? Because once you meet the parents of a child, I mean, you don't ever get over that. But boy, does it bond you to that particular case. Did you feel that way?
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, Lollie was really estranged from her family because of some abuse that had happened there. And so her friends really were her family. And it's the same thing with them, too, is I am so grateful for those two communities, and I'm so grateful for everything they were willing to share with me. To have a stranger show up and be like, I'm writing this book about this person that you love. Can you please share all your stories? And, I mean, that's really hard to ask someone to do. And they were so gracious about doing it. I spent a weekend once with Julie's parents, and her mom had brought like all the family photo albums and Julie's baby book. And as you say, at that moment, if I hadn't already committed my life to this case, which I definitely have, at that moment, there was absolutely no going back. And the book is out, and I obviously want people to read it, and I want people to feel invested in it. And meanwhile, though, I am not done with the research. The Innocence Project and I are still unpacking this case, and we're going to keep doing it until we're sure we know who did it, and that some kind of justice has been done.
Yeah, and with that being said, that's awesome. Like you have a great relationship with the family. You are still continuing research on this case because the case still remains unsolved, unfortunately. And you mentioned the book. Where can people find the book?
I am a huge fan of independent bookstores. I think they are the absolute lifeblood of communities. And so I always totally recommend that. But since this is a podcast and people like listening, I will say that this amazing actor named Gabra Zuckman, who did the audio for All Be Gone in the Dark, is the narrator for the audiobook of Trailed. And I have read that book 10,000 times, and hearing her read it out loud, it's like I'm hearing it for the first time, and she gives me goosebumps, and I know how it ends. So that's another option for folks too.
Oh, oh my gosh, I probably go through 3 or 4 books on tape a week, or, digital, whatever. The Libby app, I can't support it enough. It's the best. I've actually had librarians reach out and be like, thank you for promoting that. It is a great way for people to read. I'm like, I know. I didn't realize there was an audiobook, but I actually did the old school version. I actually read the old school book. But yeah, it's fabulous. I recommend it to all the listeners. I really think anybody who has been listening to this show, we didn't even get into it, but like Bill Thomas makes an appearance in the book. As you listeners know, Bill Thomas has been on the show many times. Kathryn, how did Bill Thomas get involved?
Well, a lot of people have tried to draw connections between the 1986 Colonial Parkway murders and the 1996 murders of Lollie and Julie. And there are some real, similarities in terms of the two crimes. And so when I saw that, I reached out to Bill Thomas, and this incredible friendship was born in a moment. And he's been such a great supporter of this book. He and I talk regularly. We're always sharing theories and information and documents. And, as you and I were talking before we started taping the podcast, it's a really small community, of people who really do these deep dives into these crimes. And, it's really incredible, these friendships that grow out of it. And thank goodness, because it's such dark, hard work. And so to be able to have friends to lean on and talk to, and sometimes, use gallows humor with, can definitely keep you going in some dark spots. So I'm really, really grateful for the larger community this has brought me.
Yeah, it's definitely a community of helpful people and people that are willing to give their time. And thank you again for giving your time. I can't recommend the book enough. I go through millions of books a week and or a year, and this was definitely one of my favorites so far in the last 12 months. So definitely everybody check it out, and yeah, go to your independent bookstores and get them. And if you want the audio version, like she said, the narrator from the I'll pick a narrator and I will just read their catalog or listen to their catalog, I should say, and I end up down
I'm telling
some
you,
crazy
Gabra
paths.
Zuckman could read you. This woman could read you
book?
a catalog. She could read you the phone book, and you would sit with rapt attention. She makes me sound so good.
Well, that's awesome. I think that is great. I mean, the fact that you already have the audiobook out and the book is available at independent bookstores and pretty much wherever you get books. But definitely go support your independent bookstore. And Kathryn, do you have any social media that people can follow, or any way that they can follow you as far as this case continues?
And that would be great. My author website is just my name, Kathryn, Kathryn, Miles.net. And on there's links to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And, one of the things I really wanted to do in this book was lay out the evidence in a way that readers felt like they could be a part of the ongoing investigation. And I definitely would love it if people check my work and tell me if they think I'm right or wrong, or, if they want to be a part of this conversation as we continue to investigate and try to solve the case. I feel like the more the merrier. And I feel like crowdsourcing amateur sleuths are absolutely a great way into these sorts of things. So I would definitely welcome the company on this journey.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, I really think that, being involved and interacting with the listeners and the readers is a great way to, keep the story alive and keep their spirits alive, Julie and Lollie. And again, Kathryn, thank you so much for taking an hour plus out of your day. I know you're this big, huge author now, so, thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the work you do and for calling attention to really important cases that deserve the time. So I'm just really grateful that your podcast is out there.
Well, thank you very much. I, again, appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. I really have to thank Kathryn Miles, author of Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. If you have not picked up the book yet, I highly recommend it. It is a true crime thriller. It will definitely keep you on the edge of your seat, and you will not be able to put it down. I would recommend, just like Kathryn did, to purchase it at your local bookstore. It's always good to support the local guy and gals. So thank you again to Kathryn. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to this week's special episode. And as always, I drop new episodes of Who Killed every Friday, as well as you can follow me on Twitter at BillHuffman3. That's if you're interested in following the leads or any shows that I have in the pipeline, you're welcome to do that. You can also support the show by donating via Venmo with my username at Bill-Huffman-3, or you can donate with my email and PayPal, and that's BillHuffman123@yahoo.com. So again, thank you guys so much for listening, and thank you to Kathryn. Thank you to her agent for setting this up. And I hope you guys enjoyed the show and hope you will pick up the book. So as always, stay healthy and be safe.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not. It's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Carol Costello, a former CNN anchor and national correspondent. This January, I'm launching a podcast about one of the first cases I ever covered as a journalist. It's one that stuck with me all of these years, the one that buried itself under my skin and stayed put. It's a true crime series about an amazing woman named Phyllis Cottle, who defied torture and death and brought a fierce rage to the quest to find her attacker. Carol Costello Presents Blind Rage is a production of Evergreen Podcasts and signature title of the Killer Podcast Network. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcast.com.